Hello, everyone. This is the final lecture for this class, Module 15 Conclusions, and I've subtitled it today, Finding Your Place in a Globalized World, a Diverse Society, and a Colonized Space. So, I really just have a few thoughts today. This will just be a really short lecture to kind of finish out this class. The first thing I want to share is some facts about our world and what an incredibly diverse world we live in, and also what an incredibly diverse state we live in. People that are not from Alaska often do not realize how very, very diverse Alaska is. So let's go through a few different facts. First of all, the global population is 7.8 billion. We are rapidly approaching 8 billion people on this planet. There are more humans alive than have ever been alive at a single moment in our history. So it stands to reason that the social sciences, the study of humanity, anthropology, sociology, these types of fields are in some regards more important than ever because there are more humans than ever. So the human sciences are more important than ever. We're also more connected than ever in some ways. So I have here one statistic: active Facebook users, 2.7 billion in 2020. A few of those are bots or whatever, but a tremendous amount of human beings are connecting in social media, in online gaming platforms, through international travel, obviously, in ways that really just weren't present even 100 years ago. Not to say that the world hasn't always been globalized to some degree. There's always been things like the Silk Road and different things, and trans-Pacific voyages of Polynesian settlers. So there's always been these connections. But the last 100 years has seen those connections just accelerated so much globalization happening now. People are more connected than they've ever been. And as a result, we experience a lot more cultural diversity in some ways, probably than a lot of our ancestors did. And so it is useful and important and helpful to understand diversity. At the same time, statistic number 3, it is expected that by 2100, up to 50% of languages will go extinct, which suggests that yes, we are more connected than ever. Even connecting in terms of finding shared ways to speak with each other, but at the same time, certain forms of diversity are threatened by that. So we live in a complex, changing kind of world. So we're in a diverse world. We're also in a really diverse state. So you may not know this, but Professor, I think he was out of UAF, he may have been out of UAA, either way. He studied the different census data for all the different census tracts, which is a fancy word, but basically a neighborhood, for all the different neighborhoods across the United States. And what he found was that the most ethnically and racially diverse neighborhood, or census tract rather, in the United States was actually Northeast Anchorage, specifically in the Mountain View area, part of Anchorage, which has a tremendous amount of people from many different language communities, cultural communities, a large number of immigrants, very diverse place. And specifically what he found is that neighborhood had not only a very large number of different racial and ethnic groups, but also that those groups were very evenly split across the population. So it wasn't sort of predominantly one group or another. So very, very diverse. That's something that just, I think folks outside of Alaska typically would not be aware of. I think a lot of people in Alaska might not be aware of that. And that's not unique to Anchorage. Anchorage is an incredibly diverse city. But let's take where I live down in Kenai Peninsula. Kenai Peninsula is diverse in a lot of ways that you probably don't realize, maybe if you don't live down here or haven't spent a lot of time down here, whether that be the fact that you have a really large percentage of people who speak Russian, Old Believers, which is a unique offshoot of Russian Orthodoxy, and, obviously Dena'ina people, Sugpiaq people. It's a very, very diverse community, which people may or may not realize. Much higher percentage of people who homeschool than a lot of other places. So just, interesting types of diversity. Alaska is also overall extremely diverse in terms of the indigenous population. So although certain groups, particularly African American and Latinx, are slightly less than the national average, in Alaska, one thing is that we have a much higher percentage of indigenous people than most states in the United States. In fact, the percentage of Alaskans who identify as Alaskan Native or Native American probably between 15 to 20%, and I would guess that that's probably an underestimate because it's based on census data, and rural communities potentially have more of an issue getting properly censused. But anyways, it's 15 to 20%, 15% if we're talking about people who just identify as Alaska Native, 20% if you also include people who identify as Alaska Native and another racial category on the census. So that's the highest of any state. That's higher than places like New Mexico, Arizona, or Oklahoma, places that we think of as having large groups of indigenous people. Finally, 8% of Alaskans are immigrants coming from all sorts of different nations. One of our biggest immigrant group is actually people from the Philippines, very large percentage of Filipino immigrants. And then 7% of Alaskans above the 8%. So you have 8% who are first-generation immigrants, 7% whom are second generation, in the sense that one or both of their parents were first-generation immigrants. So we live in an incredibly, incredibly diverse place. We also live in a colonized place. And, when I say that, I'm not here to sort of guilt trip people because they have, settler background or something like that. That's not what I do. That's not what I'm about. But to instead acknowledge a historical reality. This map, it's imperfect like any other map of this nature, but it shows the rough sort of boundaries of the traditional territories of different cultural groups in our state. I, living in Sultana, as with many of us, live and work in the lands, the traditional homelands of the Dena'ina people. That's true of those of you who live in Anchorage. That's true of those of you in Mat-Su Valley. So that's true of many of us. I live and work in Dena'ina lands. You may live and work in other kinds of lands. But we live in colonized spaces, in spaces that very often were taken by force. And specifically in Alaska, and you can learn about this more in my Alaska Native Cultures class, but specifically in Alaska, a large chunk of the lands, which are now federal lands, state lands, or private lands, really were native lands until the mid-20th century, when there was something called ANCSA, or the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. So this is colonized space, and we need to understand that and respect that and acknowledge that. And I think acknowledging means more than just saying the words. I think it also means coming to understand what are the unique conditions facing Alaska Native people, and what can we do to ensure that Alaska Native people are meaningfully respected, honored, and included as part of our Alaskan community. So, all of that to suggest that we live in diverse places and complex places, and places where, it's useful to remember human beings. So I think an anthropology class is useful. And I hope this particular anthropology class, I say this is the conclusion. And for many of you, it will be. It'll be the last anthropology class you take, unless I've properly sold you on being a major. But even if it is the last anthropology class you take, and even if this is the last lecture, I hope it's not a conclusion. Because conclusion, if you look at conclusion, you look at the Latin roots of the word conclusion, it means to completely shut, like to completely shut a book or something like that. But I hope this isn't that. I hope this isn't you closing the book on learning about different cultures and traditions and histories. Instead, I hope you always remember to be curious about the groups around you, to be curious about the histories of how things came to be. And remember that, the groups around us, the different cultures, have histories, have languages and cultures which inform their present day realities. And that hopefully that helps you be a little kinder and a little more just to your coworkers or to your family members or anybody else who's from a background different than your own. And I hope that you remember the 4 fields of anthropology. And even if you never have anything to do with them in terms of your career, I hope that you've learned something from each of these fields. I hope you interview like a cultural anthropologist. And what I mean by that is that you listen and truly ask thoughtful questions when you're trying to understand the backgrounds of different people. And that rather than rely on stereotypes, you go and speak to people from those communities when you want to understand them or seek out their voices, which is easier than ever in the internet age. I hope that, like an archaeologist, you excavate, not literally in the ground. I expect most of you won't be doing that. But what I mean by that is that you dig deep into the histories of different groups and of why things are the way they are, why it is, for example, that despite this originally being Dena'ina space, that is now a group that is in the minority of our communities. And so how did that come in most parts of this area, at least in the Anchorage and Kenai Soldotna part? So how did that come to be, right? Dig into those histories and try to understand why things are the way they are. I hope that, like a good linguistic anthropologist, you listen to what people are saying around you, listen to framing and things like how people are talking, to try to understand better what they're trying to say and what their culture is trying to say. And I hope you, like a good physical anthropologist, observe and document and measure and try to be at once both a humanist and a scientist about the world around us, and try to observe the cause and effect and evolutions and diversities in DNAs, metaphorical rather than literal, that inform all of us. And remember that we are all one human family, and therefore it is our responsibility to try to understand each other and live well together. And it's a heck of a lot more fun that way anyways. Thank you for a great semester.